All right, we're on. Welcome to Wednesday night Bible class. Glad you're here this evening. Before we get started, I was going to pass on a joke that Tracy's granddaughter told us, fresh from the Marlowe commencement. It was pretty good. So this fellow buys a parrot and buys it at the local market, and he gets it home, and all this parrot does is cuss. And this parrot just can't talk without cussing. And the guy gets after him and said, "Look, you got to stop this cussing." The parrot said, "Oh, I'll try to," but he just couldn't quit. And the guy got so discouraged with him, he said, "I'm just going to put you in my freezer. Maybe you'll learn to quit cussing." And so he put him in his freezer. A little while later, the parrot started crying out, "Get me out, get me out, get me out." So the guy had a heart and went and got the parrot out, and the parrot said, "I promise." He bowed his head and said, "I'm so sorry I've been cussing so much. I'll never cuss again." And the man said, okay, I'll keep you out. And the parrot said, "I just have one question for you." "Okay, what's that?" "What did that chicken in the freezer do?" Anyway, that's pretty good, isn't it? Anyway, so just had a little thought hit me a while ago. So on the way here, I stopped in the restroom over there. And it's wonderful. Let's look. I guess it's been repainted. I don't know if it's been repainted, but the lights are so bright. I don't know about the other restrooms. But, kind of a spiritual truth hit me that I didn't realize how dark the restroom was until I saw how light it could be. And, a lot of people in this world that are walking in darkness don't realize the darkness they're in until they're exposed to some light. And you see, that's us. And so if we don't shine our light brightly, there's people in this world that will never realize the darkness they're in. Anyway, so I thought about that as I was walking to the restroom a while ago. Okay, so we're in 2 Samuel. Raise your hand if you don't have a lesson sheet so the ushers can bring you one so you can follow along. We're doing chapter 8 and 9 tonight, and as usual, we'll quickly do a review of the lesson from 2 weeks ago so you can catch up to us and kind of segue into the current lesson. So in chapter 7, David had a great idea. So he's now king in Jerusalem, and he's with his good buddy and advisor and prophet Nathan, and he says, "I've been thinking, I have a great idea." He said, I live in this wonderful, wonderful palace, and the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the presence of God, is still living in a tent, in a tabernacle there in Jerusalem. He said, "I think I'm going to make God a great temple." And Nathan, being the good buddy, said, "Yeah, I think that's a great idea." Well, then Nathan goes to bed that night, and God gives Nathan a dream. And he says, "Nathan, I want you to tell David no. Tell David no." And that's a lot. All of us have been there. When we think we have a great idea, we think that's going to do something great in our lives, whether it's a relationship, a job, a business, education, investment, whatever, and it doesn't turn out so good. So we've all had those great plans fall through. So what happened to David? So Nathan, God went on in this dream and told Nathan, "Tell David I've got something much better for him than just a physical temple. His son can build me a temple. I've got bigger plans for David." He says, "I'm going to make him a great name. I'm going to give him great lands. I'm going to make his son's successor kings, and I'm going to give him rest from his enemies." So there on your lesson sheet, we showed how that was called the Davidic covenant. It's not really called a covenant in chapter 7, but when David is on his deathbed, he recounts and he calls this a covenant that God made with him. And we compared it to the covenant God made with Abraham. And you see it's basically exactly the same. He promised both of them a great name. He promised both of them children that would succeed him and become great. Promised both of them land, and he promised both of them that they would overcome their enemies. So we ended the chapter with David giving a great heartfelt prayer of gratitude because he realized that God had bigger plans than what he had in mind. And often that's like us. We ended talking about the potter and the clay. So many places in the Bible it describes God as the potter and us as the clay. And clay is not supposed to say to the potter, this is what I want you to make me. The potter is in charge of the clay is not in charge of the potter. And so many times, in our great dreams, we're worried about the physical, kind of like David, he was going to build a physical temple. But, we kind of, our prayers tend to center around things that we would like to get or receive. And it's like we're saying to the potter, God, make me a plate, because plates receive. And God's saying, no, sometimes you don't need to be a plate. We got plenty of plates in the kingdom, people that just want to get stuff. We need you to be a pitcher, because pitchers receive things and then they pour them out. So if you receive some hope from me, I want you to give that hope out. If you receive some peace from me, I want you to give that peace out. If you receive some love from me, I want you to share that love with others. You receive knowledge of salvation from me and become saved, I want you to share that knowledge with others. In other words, what pitchers receive, they give out. And that's kind of what God was telling David, that there's more to life than just something physical. That this is a spiritual, that I'm more interested in you spiritually than I am interested in you, what you collect and get physically. Anyway, so that was the lesson last time. Now let's go to chapter 8. And what we're going to see that here in chapter 8, God actually begins the process of granting 3 of these 4 covenant promises to David here immediately in chapter 8. And what this chapter is, it's basically a list of David's military victories as king. So we don't really know over what period of time these occurred. It's kind of like the author kind of, lived after David and just kind of compiled all this list. So it's probably a great period of time, but he kind of lists how David expanded his kingdom by conquering the nations around him. So that's kind of what we're going to look at here in chapter 8. And there's a lot of things in this chapter that have to do with cultural aspects of the warfare back then. And once more, pretty much everything I say from this chapter as a comment came from this cultural study Bible that I've highly recommended you get. The NIV Cultural Background Study Bible. You can get it on Amazon because it's really, really informative as to help you understand why certain things happen. So let's kind of dig into this. Let's start with chapter 8, verse 1. It says, in the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg-Ammah from the control of the Philistines. Now, we've also mentioned as we've got into 2 Samuel that 1 Chronicles is a parallel book to 2 Samuel. So if there's something we don't understand just reading it in 2 Samuel, we immediately go to the parallel verse in 2 Chronicles. And so archaeologists and scholars have no idea where this little village is that was mentioned here in 2 Samuel 8, verse 1, this Metheg-Ammah. So we go to 1 Chronicles 18:1, which I've got on the lesson sheet right below it, and there's the parallel verse, and we'll see exactly what the author is talking about. So in the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Gath and its surrounding villages from the control of the Philistines. Okay, so obviously this Metheg-Ammah in 8:1 is one of these surrounding villages from Gath. So we've studied in the past how the Philistines lived in the area towards the coast between the Mediterranean Sea and the Israelites, and there were 5 major cities. Kind of the most major of the 5 cities was Gath, and that was where Goliath was from. There's a lot of the giants that lived around that area. So if you control the major city of a nation, you kind of control that nation. So that's what the author is implying, that David basically defeated the Philistines. You know, we've heard about the battles of them throughout Saul and then the time of the judges. So for several hundred years, the Philistines have just wreaked havoc with Israel, but finally David gets control of them. So let's bring the map up. Okay, let's see here. See if I can work this. All right, so this is about the whole chapter. So what we're going to talk about here. So this first little red arrow, that is what we talked about in chapter 5, where when David was king of Judah, then when he became king of all Israel, he took Jerusalem, which is right in the center there, to be the capital. Okay? And then what we just now read is this pink arrow. So Philistia is this area between Israel and the coast. So Gath is that little dot right there. That's the main city in Philistia. Okay, let's go to verse 2 in chapter 8. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured off a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. So again, the Cultural Study Bible, well, let me go ahead and show you the arrow here. Go ahead and put the map back up. Okay, so Moab is this, see, so here's the Dead Sea is right here. So Moab is on the other side of the Dead Sea. So that's the purple arrow that we're talking about right now. Okay, so that's Moab. Okay, so the Cultural Study Bible tells us that in ancient enemy warfare, and that in the Near East, that when you defeated a country, that generally all the soldiers were executed or sold into slavery. And they did that to prevent a future revolt. So here, actually, it seemed like David is rather harsh by killing 2/3, but instead, actually, he's showing some mercy by allowing 1/3 to live and go back home. And then it says they became subject to him and brought him tribute. In other words, they were paying taxes. And so they would do that through either agricultural produce or livestock or precious metals or other goods, things that they produced. He taxed that. And so, if you think back to the American colonies, one of the reasons for the revolt against Britain was the heavy taxation. So Britain was using all of its colonies around the world to create wealth for the British Empire. And so our colonists thankfully revolted. Remember the Boston Tea Party and about the tea tax and the saying they had no taxation without representation. And so that's what that war was all about. And so here we are today because of that. So that was what it was expected back then. When a country captured another country, it was to strengthen the wealth of the major country. Okay, so let's go to 3 and 4 now. Moreover, David defeated Hadaezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, and he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. So this area is way past the north of the map that we've been showing you. So the Euphrates River is way up north in modern Iraq. So that's how far David was going to defeat other kingdoms. And so back then the chariots were kind of like the army tanks of the day. I mean, it was really hard for an infantryman to fight against a moving chariot. They'd usually have one chariot driver, then either a spearman or a archer beside him, so they could move very rapidly. Anyway, so it tells you what David did with them, and it says he hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. Back in Deuteronomy 17, we've referenced this before, God gave Moses a law of the kings. In other words, how he wanted the kings to behave once Israel had kings. Now, one of those laws was they would not have many wives. Well, obviously, we've already read how many wives David had taken, and then we know Solomon takes a lot more. But we also read in Deuteronomy 17 that said Israel's kings are not to acquire great numbers of horses, because they were certainly the strength in warfare, and we know that God wanted Israel to depend on him and not their military might. And then, of course, later in his life, David gets in trouble for numbering all the tribes and all the army members, because God wants Israel to depend on him. But that's why he hamstrung all but 100 of the horses. So your hamstring muscles are the back of your thigh. And so if you cut some of those tendons, it makes it really hard to walk, but especially you cannot run. So if you hamstring horses on the back legs, it makes it where they cannot run. So basically they were not useful for warfare. Okay, verse 5 and 6. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadaezer, king of Zobah, that's the guy up by the Euphrates River, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. And the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Okay, bring the map back up. Okay, so the dark blue here, so there's Damascus. So the kingdom of Aram is the Arameans, and Damascus is the kingdom, so is the capital. So Zobah and the Euphrates River are up here somewhere. Anyway, they went to help these guys, and David said, okay, we're going to get you. So he conquered them. Okay, verse 7 and 8. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadaezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Teba and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadaezer, David took a great quantity of bronze. So what he's doing here, he's collecting precious metals and collecting them, and he's going to take them back home. Verse 9 and 10. When King Tau, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadaezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadaezer, who had been at war with Tau. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Joram brought with him articles of silver and gold and bronze. So here we have a guy that's politically smart. This Tau, king of Hamath, realizes that David is the big power right now. So instead of waiting for David to come battle him, he sees what's going on, and so he actually sends expensive gifts to David, and basically kind of a peace offering, like, let's have peace, a peace delegation. And he sends precious metals. And so the Hamath is far north also. And this is a custom today. We see this today. 747 given to our president and the country just a week or two ago, from a small kingdom that said, okay, we see what you're doing around the world. We want peace. We want peace. And it's usually when a weaker nation is trying to get the favor of a stronger nation. Okay, verse 11 and 12. So King David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued: Edom and Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadaezer, son of Rehab, king of Zobah. And so it's just telling us that, David was not getting these things for himself. He was starting to collect things because God had told him through Nathan the prophet, I'm going to let your son build me a temple. And so he's collecting things that eventually can be repurposed, melted down, and used for building the temple. And we'll read this later in David's life, that he had collected lots and lots and lots of building materials in addition to these precious metals, so that Solomon could start building the temple very quickly after he became king and didn't have to collect all this. I mean, there wasn't a Lowe's or Home Depot or a T.H. Rogers you go and get all your building materials from. I mean, you really had to go get it yourself. And so David is starting that process. Okay, verse 13 and 14. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Okay, so let's get the map back out again. Okay, so Edom is down here. So Edom is south of Moab. So here's the Dead Sea here. So now we're getting far south. And so this is where David, and then not mentioned in this chapter is how he took the Amalekites who are here. So the Edomites were descendants of Esau. So remember Jacob and Esau, sons of Isaac, grandsons of Abram. So Edom was a son of Esau. And so this is where that group lived. So these are actually very, very distant relatives of the Israelites, but they were not necessarily serving the God of Israel. So David took them over, and the Valley of Salt, because the Dead Sea is also called the Salt Sea, so below that is called the Valley of Salt. And so, let's see here. Okay, verse 15 through 18. So what's next is, after all these victories, we goes through a list of men, and it's kind of like this is David's cabinet of advisors. You know, our presidents have a group of men, and each one's kind of over a different area of government, but they come together and they discuss problems jointly. So it's kind of a cabinet of advisors. So let's look at verse 15 through 18. So David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Amalek, son of Abithar, were priests. Sariah was the secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. And David's sons were priests/officials. Okay, so this is what the Cultural Study Bible said about this. Joab, as we know, was the army general, and in ancient nations, the army general was generally the second in command. They didn't really have a vice king or vice president. The army general was kind of the second in command. And we've learned from previous lessons that he is actually David's nephew, but we presume they're about the same age because Joab is the son of his much older sister, Zeruiah. So Joab is his army general and basically his second in command. Okay, then it says Jehoshaphat is the recorder. So in ancient times, this was kind of like what we would call a press secretary today. This is the person that would in charge of communication between a king's edicts and the country. So he would send out the messengers, the heralds on horses or whatever animals to all areas of the land, say here's what the king has, edicts have been made. So he's sort of the press secretary. And then we have two priests. These are from the tribe of Levi, Zadok and Ahimelech. Then it says Sariah was the secretary. And the Cultural Study Bible tells us that this is an interesting name because it's not really a Jewish name, and he's actually listed 3 or 4 times, and every time the spelling is different in the Hebrew Bible. And so it's assumed that he's probably an Egyptian who is a Jewish convert. And as we know, he was, the kingdom of Egypt had been in for centuries and was very, very good at writing and administering court documents. They were very, very good at keeping records. And so that's what is assumed about this man. We know nothing else about him. And then it mentions Benaiah, says son of Jehoiada over the Kerethites and Pelethites. So Cultural Study Bible said that most of the kings back then, for their personal guards, I guess you'd call their bodyguards, like Secret Service to the president, they would not use native people because native people, that their own people could get caught up in politics and might get caught up in a coup. They might be promised things. If you'll kill the king, I'll give this to you in the new regime and stuff. So they tended to use mercenaries. And so these Kerethites and Pelethites are thought to be mercenaries that David hired to be his bodyguard, because mercenaries from some other country just cared about getting paid by the king. They really weren't going to get caught up in local politics. But he did use this Benaiah to be in charge of them. And we know more about them if you fast forward to chapter 23, when it's talking about the mighty men of David, and we'll get to that obviously in several lessons, but it talks specifically about this fellow. He most likely came to David in the cave of Adullam back in 1 Samuel 22, where David was hiding from Saul, and about 400 other men kind of came to be with him who were kind of outcast, but David taught them to be great, great warriors. And so we believe that so that's why David can trust this guy. He's been with him since the beginning. Chapter 23 says some things some of his great exploits. Says he struck down 2 of Moab's greatest warriors, so I guess that means at the same time. So he himself struck down 2 of Moab's greatest warriors. It says he killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day. I thought that's interesting. I know there's one of the Christian writers from D.C. is Mark Batterson. He's written a book by that title. But that's where he gets that from this verse. He killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day. So that'd be a tough job, but Benaiah did it. And then it says he killed an Egyptian who had a spear. So I guess that means he had no weapon, but he killed a guy who was coming at him with a spear. So obviously he was a great warrior. Anyway, and then it says David's sons, and in 1 Samuel it says priest. If you go over to 1 Chronicles, it says officials. It turns out the Hebrew word here can actually mean either one, and so we know that David's sons were from the tribe of Judah because he was. So obviously they can't be Levitical priests. So most likely they were court officials, so they were like sort of in charge of the palace day-to-day business affairs. Anyway, okay, so that's kind of the end of chapter 8. So let's look at, there's one more map I want to show you. Okay, so if you take all those conquered nations that we just showed you, this is sort of a map of the extent of David's kingdom. So all these colored areas here would be the extent of David's kingdom. And see, here's the Sea of Galilee, there's the Dead Sea. So this area right here, kind of the salmon colored, is the original Israel, and then here's Edom and Moab and Aram that David has, and then he conquered some of these people up here that he's getting tribute from, but they're not necessarily part of his kingdom. Okay, let's go to chapter 9. So on the back of your lesson sheet, just kind of switch gears here and get into a story that's really interesting. So like we said, chapter 8, we don't know the extent of the years. Everything in the Bible in these stories is not necessarily chronological. So we don't know that all those things happened in then chapter 9. But nevertheless, this is what happened in chapter 9. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now this word kindness here is the covenant love hesed we've mentioned several times before. So he remembers the covenant he made with Jonathan, Saul's oldest son, who had been the prince who would have been succession to Saul, had God not anointed David to be next. And so there on your lesson sheet in 1 Samuel 20 verse 15, this is when this covenant was made between Jonathan and David. Jonathan told David, "Do not ever cut off your kindness," that's that hesed, loving kindness, "from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." So see, in that situation, Jonathan realized that he, the crown prince, was not going to be the next king, that David had been anointed by God, and so he acknowledges that. And he's asking David, when you become king, be kind to my family. And the reason for that is again, the Cultural Study Bible brings out that in those times, when you became king, you killed off the previous king's family. And Pastor Mike even last week talked about Herod, who was in charge of the infanticide at the time of Jesus. He even killed some of his brothers and sisters. I mean, that's how you make sure nobody does a coup. And so that went on for centuries. And so Jonathan here in talking to David is realizing that once David becomes king, everybody related to Saul becomes an enemy. It's considered an enemy of the court. And so he's asking him to be kind to his family. Okay, verse 2 through 5. Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness," that covenant love? Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel in Lodebar." So King David had him brought from Lodebar, from the house of Machir. So David's asking, is there anybody from the house of Saul I can show kindness to? So he's going against culture here. And a servant of King Saul was around named Ziba, and said, yes, I know of a son of Jonathan that is still alive. And he's in Lodebar, and that is, bring up that last map if you would. Okay, so here's Jericho, here's Jerusalem, which is the capital. So here's the Jordan River. So the Israeli tribes on this side of the river are called the Transjordan tribes. And so you see over here is a desert. And so we believe that Lodebar was about as far as you could get in Israel over here in the desert area. And it was like he was hiding out for good reason, because as far as he knew, David was going to kill everybody he could from Saul's family. So he's in Lodebar, he's hiding out, and he's living in the house of Machir, but he's lame. In other words, he can't work. So how did he get lame? Well, let's go back to chapter 4, verse 4, there in 2 Samuel, there on your lesson sheet. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. So you remember the last chapter in 1 Samuel was the great battle where Saul and three of his sons died, including Jonathan. And it says at the end of that chapter that once the Philistines had routed the Israelites and killed Saul and his sons and killed lots of them, that they took over a lot of the towns and villages in that area in northern Israel. And so obviously Jonathan's son was being kept in a household there in one of those cities that the Philistines were overrunning, and so they had to escape for their lives. Okay, so his nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. And so, back then, no orthopedics, no clinic, no x-rays, no casting. So obviously this young boy at age 5, but as the nursemaid was running with him, she absolutely dropped him and either broke his lower legs or feet or whatever, and they didn't heal properly, so he could not walk. So there's not too many desk jobs back then, so obviously he was out of work. So he had to depend on somebody else to care for him. But being scared of the incoming king, he tried to get as far away and hide as he could, so he hid in Lodebar. And as we said so many times in the Bible, names mean something. It's always interesting to look up names, because over and over and over you'll find that names actually mean something. Lodebar means something. So lo means none or without or no. Debar means pasture. So Lodebar was a desolate place, so a desert place, no pasture. There was not anything for animals to eat there. So he's out there on the eastern desert, as far away from Jerusalem as he can get and still be in the country of Israel. Okay, so let's go to 6 through 8. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, so David sent for him, so he's coming to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth, at your service, Mephibosheth replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness, that's that hesed, covenant kindness, for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? So Mephibosheth has been hiding since age 5. So we don't know exactly how long this is. We're guessing it's about 20 years later, so we're thinking he's a young man, maybe 25 or so. And he just absolutely cannot believe the kindness that King David is showing him. Not only not killing him, but then also providing for him. He's going to let him come and eat with him in the palace. All the land that Saul had, he's going to grant him the goods from that land. And then Mephibosheth says, why would you notice a dead dog like me? Now, in our culture, dogs are our pets, our beloved. We've taken a cat to the vet before, and the vet says, your loved one here. I'm sure some of us feel that way about dogs. But back then, dogs were scavengers. Dogs were not pets. And so they were dirty scavengers. So they were some of the lowest things in culture. And then you get a dead dog, and that's even worse. And so Mephibosheth says, to you, I'm a dead dog. Why would you do things like this for me? Okay, verse 9 through 11. Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward or servant, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants, so just telling us that he had plenty of people to farm all this land. Then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Okay, let's see here. The Cultural Study Bible mentioned that in ancient times, if a new king did not necessarily kill off some of the previous king's sons, they might do a house arrest inside the palace just so they keep an eye on them. Might even use them kind of like an advisor, but not let them get out and form a coup. But I don't think this was it at all, because David we're going to read that he lives in Jerusalem, not in the palace. We're going to read that he has a son, and so David's doing all these wonderful things for him. So he's not just under house arrest. He is truly being honored by David. And you notice that word's kindness, that hesed, there in verse 1. Who can I show this hesed, loving kindness to? Verse 3, how can I show God's kindness? Verse 7, I will surely show kindness for the sake of your father. And this is that covenant love that God has with his people. And so David says, basically calling Mephibosheth his people, because I'm going to show you the loving kindness that a father would have with a son. And David was actually willing to do that not just because he was Jonathan's son, but he said anybody from the entire house of Saul, which is really phenomenal if you think of the way that Saul chased David for 12 or 13 years trying to kill him. And so David was willing to do that for anybody that was descendant of Saul, not just because he was Mephibosheth, but the son of his good friend Jonathan. So let's quickly look as we, let's read the last couple of verses here. So Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table because he was lame at both feet. Okay, so what I want to look at real quickly was, what does covenant love include? What does covenant love include? Because it's really what David did for him exhibits what covenant loving kindness is. So if you look at verse 7, the first one, it says protection. I will give you protection. Don't be afraid, Mephibosheth. You have no reason to be afraid of me. I'm going to protect you. Okay, number 2, provision. In verse 7, he said, I will restore to you all the land your grandfather Saul. Then number 3, in verse 7 and 9, says, you will always eat at the king's table like one of his sons. So he's given him position, because when you eat with someone, you're saying to them, we are equals. We are equals. It is not beneath me to not, and I'm not going to eat with you because you're beneath me. No, we're going to eat because we're equals. And so socially, I mean, that's even true today. One of the best ways to become friends with somebody is to eat with them and get to know them. And so David has shown loving kindness by giving Mephibosheth protection, provision, and position. And I was thinking about this, about Psalms 23. There's a verse there in Psalm 23 that says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. We believe David wrote this psalm later in life as he reflected back on God's goodness to him throughout his life. And I was thinking about that verse. You know, in his lifetime, how many times had he sat across the table from people who were enemies or potential enemies? You know, back when he was in Saul's household, before, you know, Saul twice tried to kill him throwing spears at him, and he was still a member of the royal household because he had married one of Saul's daughters. And yet he's sitting across the table eating with King Saul, who basically was in the process of becoming his enemy. And then we read about later in 1 Samuel how he finally got so tired of running from Saul that he went to Gath, to the King Achish of Gath, a Philistine king, for political asylum. And apparently he was there for a little while before Achish sent David and his men down to Ziklag, about 30 miles away, and just said, y'all stay down there, because it wasn't real popular among the other Philistine kings for David and his men to stay there in Gath. But you know, they had meals together. Even though David was seeking political asylum, he was eating with an enemy. He was eating across the table with an enemy, but God kept him safe on that table. And then here, for years and years and years, he sat across the table from a grandson of Saul, Mephibosheth. Of course, Mephibosheth himself was lame and really couldn't mount a coup himself, but you know, could he out in Jerusalem get with some of the old Saul sympathizers and try? He could have. But, you know, God has set the table before him, before his enemies. I thought that was pretty interesting. Anyway, this story about Mephibosheth, I believe, is one more shadow or type of something in the New Testament that we're given a shadow of in the Old Testament. Let me kind of go through that. First of all, I look at the name of what Mephibosheth called his son. So Mephibosheth has been greatly blessed by David and been given protection, provision, and position. So he has a son. So obviously he gets married, has a son. He names his son Micah. And the word Micah in Hebrew means who is like God. And I think Mephibosheth was honoring David by naming his son that, because he felt like David was acting as God would act towards him. And then the other thing that made me think that this is a shadow is that if David is like God, we are like Mephibosheth spiritually. So Mephibosheth was lame. He lived in the desert, and because of who he belonged to, he was considered an enemy of David. Spiritually, before we were saved, we were lame spiritually. We lived in a spiritual desolation, and we were enemies of the cross. Romans 5:10 says, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. So just like David sought out Mephibosheth, his enemy, to show him loving kindness, covenant love, God, through Jesus, reached out to us when we were lame spiritually. We were in spiritual desolation. We were enemies of the cross, and said, I want you to come and eat at my table. So God has promised us his spiritual protection, his spiritual provision, and has given us position in his kingdom as adopted children so that we can eat at his table. That's the lesson. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you got something out of that. All right, let's stand. We'll have our closing prayer. Thank you, God, for this time we can look at your word and apply it to our lives and see how there's so many teachings. The depth of what you've given us in your Bible is just so incredible that we can understand the depth of your love for us, how when we were yet enemies of the cross, when we were lame spiritually, when we lived in the spiritual desert, you sought us out to bring us in to eat at your table. Thank you, God. We pray this through your Son's name. Amen. Amen. You're dismissed.